Canada has actually produced a salient distinction between those non-white women signified as women of colour and Indigenous women. In particular, this demarcation among these groups of racialized women is a product of different forms of gendered racism and colonialism. Thus, whereas various women of colour have been constructed through racist representations grounded in earlier ideologies of European colonialism, in which non-white others were constructed as inferior, as Shireen Razak knows, the cultures of Indigenous people have faced eradication and extinction in Canada. The violence faced by Indigenous women in particular has been configured through the desire of white colonizers not only to dilute or inferiorize, but also by attempts to annihilate those who represent Indigenous bodies and ways of knowing. These forms of domination in which we have the construct of women of colour and Indigenous women are relational in that they're constitutive of each other. By this I mean that the matrix of domination takes on shape according to gendered different historical legacies that explicitly and implicitly signify various others in relation to one another so as to sustain the norms of whiteness and masculinity. So there's a dynamic not only between Indigenous and non-Indigenous and those signified as women of white women and Indigenous women, but also between the processes that signify distinctions between women of colour and Indigenous women. Furthermore, an account of meaning-making reveals another relational dynamic in which there are constructions between those signified as Indigenous men and Indigenous women. So, for example, an account reveals that the state has aimed to discipline those status Indian women who did not remain within the legal confines of the colonial definition of Indian, by denying status to those women who married non-status men. So we can think here of the Indian Act, for example, which, although was amended in 1985, effectively continues to deny grandchildren Indian status, therefore re-entrenching a patriarchal lineage of different kinds of gendered norms. In this regard, an account of meaning-making reveals that status Indian women were relationally differentiated from status Indian men. And while the identities of these men were also constituted through processes of racialization and racism, modes of gender privilege also played out. As such, the identities of some First Nations women are shaped by gendered colonial and nationalist discourses that differentiate men and women in such a way as to sustain the privilege of the white male norm. Furthermore, an account of meaning-making also reveals the ways in which Indigenous women's identities are differentiated in relation to one another. The colonial imaginary has produced distinctions, for example, between First Nations, Inuit and Métis women that often erase Indigenous rights and obscure the significance of one's nation. So, for example, in the 1800s, to affirm the privileging of white bodies, colonial governments articulated the legal definition of status Indian so as to split Indigenous people into particular categories, which then erased the legal representations of indigeneity for Métis and Inuit people, who then fell into the status of a unitary form of Canadian citizenship. This colonial goal to legally render Inuit and Métis indigeneity invisible was done in tandem with a desire to discipline and eradicate those who were marked as status Indian. As such, through colonialism, the notion of the Indigenous woman as a national citizen was produced and reproduced by signifying various Indigenous people differently, but always as aliens on their own territory from the perspective of the white colonizer. Now, while today there's certainly been recognition of these various kinds of groups, as Patricia Moncher-Angus has rightly argued, these may simply be new ways of governing Indigenous people. And she, in fact, has a preference for Indigenous women to assume the identity of their nation, so as to be recognized as Mohawk or Cree or Mi'kmaq, rather than First Nations, Inuit or Métis. The point of this is that an account of meaning-making allows us to examine the ways in which relational signification takes place to subordinate and create distinctions between those understood as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Now, I'm not suggesting here that there is no agency in the meaning-making processes of Indigenous women. Rather, there are various ways, dialectical and relational ways, in which differing norms of gendering function through differing norms of whiteness. Let me illustrate this also by examining the ways in which the identities of Muslim women's identities have been constructed. The dialectic and relational aspects of the matrix also therefore become visible through an account of meaning-making processes that signify Muslim women's identities in the context now known as 9/11. Whereas the first account on indigenous women brings into view the legacy of sexist colonialism, the construction of Muslim women reveals the operation of Orientalist and Eurocentric sexism that is tied to Islamophobia. An account of meaning-making, therefore, allows us to examine a dialectical dynamic that exists between those signified as Western and those signified as non-Western. And here we can think about the work of such thinkers as Edward Said. Since 9/11, for example, an account of meaning-making reveals that hegemonic processes have produced significations of Muslim women as illegitimate citizens who are contrary to the Canadian way. Such Muslims are seen as anti-Canadian and assaulting the very fabric of the nation. This is a continued legacy of racialized nationalism in which Canada imagines itself as a white man's country in which Muslims are constructed as strange and strangers regardless of their legal status in Canada. An account of meaning-making reveals that these depictions reinforce a preference for whiteness, which is associated with liberal freedom, rights, choices, self-determination, and secularism, without accountability for the ways in which Orientalist signs are reproduced by Western understandings of itself. Accountability for meaning-making therefore reveals that these Orientalist processes of othering both privilege whiteness and erase the historical ways in which white European colonizers restricted and regulated the rights and freedoms and choices of various others through violence, imperialism, and colonialism. So here we see the norms of Europeanness and whiteness being entrenched through a dialectical dynamic between those signified as Western and non-Western. An account of meaning-making also reveals that there's a relational dynamic playing out between those such that it constitutes the identities of Muslim women in relation to white women. Sexist Eurocentric representations of Muslim women are constructed such that they are understood as victims of their own oppressive culture, in which only white men can save brown women from their terrible brown men. An account of meaning-making reveals that these constructions merely serve to reiterate hidden Orientalist significations of racialized women as universal dependents and victims of Muslim male violence, Arab family systems, Islamic and religious codes, and national economic structures, as Chandra Mohanty has rightly argued in her famous piece, Under Western Eyes. Thus, an account of meaning-making reveals that in relation to those signified as Western white women, the Muslim woman is represented as not being progressive, modern, liberal, secular, aspects that are key to the project of nation building. This is especially the case if she covers her head or her body, in which she becomes the pitied woman who is culture-bound, without agency, and intolerable because she cannot help herself. This is done in relation to white women who themselves are subject to patriarchal and sexist norms, but in which the Muslim woman is understood as an other, so that the norms of European liberalism and gendered norms of whiteness can be re-entrenched. An account of meaning-making further reveals that the symbols of Muslim women as other are further perpetuated in relation to those not only racialized and gendered as white women, who are depicted as liberal and modern, but also in relation to those signified as women of color who are not Muslim. Shireen Razak describes this process in the following way. She says, this is a quote, "It is not only that some women are considered to be worth more than other women, but that the status of one woman depends on the subordinate status of another in many complex ways." End quote. It's precisely this that an account of meaning-making allows us to get at, the complexity and contradictory ways in which systems of meaning-making operate and interact together. So, for example, we can see that on the one hand, the Muslim woman falls into the category of the model minority South Asian, who is relationally more desirable than the subject, say, of the indigenous or the black woman, even though all fall short of the preference for the citizen who is white, able-bodied, heterosexual, and male. This account of meaning-making reveals that there are hierarchies of otherness, in which the model minority South Asian is conceptualized as a contributor to the growth of the nation, whose presence is not ideal, but warranted for reasons of social and economic capital. So what we see playing out here is the notion of the worker, the able-bodied worker, as the systems of disability playing out in relation to systems of capitalism to construct the notion of the model minority. Through this discourse of the model minority, interactive systems of gendering, racialization, and capitalism relationally construct Indigenous women and Black women as poor citizens who won't or don't or can't integrate. Thus, without referencing the historical conditions that produce otherness, dominant discourses violently signify Black women as welfare mothers who cannot alleviate their poverty, as aggressive matriarchs who emasculate their husbands and lovers, and as Jezebels who are sexually loose and hostile, as Patricia Hill Collins has argued. And Indigenous women are signified as prostitutes or sexually promiscuous, welfare dependent, and criminals, as Patricia Montu Angus has shown. While all this is going on, an account of meaning making reveals that the South Asian woman remains constructed as the non-white othered, who is subject to the oppressive ways of her husband, her father, her son, her brothers. But in contrast to the Indigenous and the Black woman, the Muslim woman is also signified as more pliable and obedient, highly driven by the desire for education, and committed to the institutions of heterosexual marriage and motherhood through these dominant discourses. An account of meaning making helps to show that these systems of meaning making are ways for those signified as white to regulate encounters with various kinds of others. So there's a relational dynamic playing out between other and other. At the same time, and on the other hand,